The morning air in Portland was crisp and unforgiving. It was the kind of October morning that reminded you why you lived in the Pacific Northwest, the way the mist clung to the Willamette River, the way the early light painted everything in shades of silver and gray. Sarah Chen stood at her apartment window on the 23rd floor of the Sterling, an upscale residential building in downtown Portland's Pearl District, and watched the city wake up beneath her. At 5 in the morning, the streets were nearly empty. A few joggers passed below. A delivery truck made its slow way down the avenue. The world was still quiet, still belonging mostly to the night. She loved this time. Sarah had always been a creature of routine and precision. Her therapist would later note in confidential files that this precision had been both her greatest strength and perhaps her greatest vulnerability. Everything in her life followed a pattern, a carefully choreographed dance that she'd perfected over 28 years of living. Wake at 5, jog for 45 minutes, shower, coffee, black, no sugar. Check her flight manifest 3 times. Arrive at Portland International Airport by 10:00 a.m. for a noon departure. Never be late, never be unprepared, never disappoint. Her apartment reflected this philosophy. Walking through the 1,200 square feet of space was like walking through a museum of controlled living. The kitchen gleamed. The bedroom had a bed that was made military style, corners tucked so precisely you could bounce a coin off the fitted sheet, a habit from her Air Force days that she'd never quite shaken. Her books were organized not alphabetically, but by subject and then by publication date. Her flight manuals occupied an entire wall, each one bookmarked with color-coded tabs indicating sections she reviewed regularly. She owned 7 pairs of identical black running shoes, each replaced after exactly 500 miles. The current pair she'd been wearing sat by the door, ready for this morning's run. Sarah Chen was what people called accomplished beyond her years. She'd graduated from UC Berkeley with honors, joined the Air Force immediately after, and spent 6 years as a fighter pilot before transitioning to commercial aviation. The transition was unusual. Most military pilots went to the major airlines immediately, but Sarah had wanted more. She'd wanted to prove something, though even she couldn't quite articulate what. So she'd taken a position with Pacific Airways, a regional carrier based in Portland, to build up hours and seniority before potentially moving to one of the majors. In 3 years with Pacific Airways, she'd become one of their most respected pilots. Passengers requested her flights. Other pilots sought her advice. The airline had already approached her about becoming a training captain, an honor typically reserved for much older, more experienced aviators. But Sarah's precision and control extended beyond her professional life. Her colleagues knew almost nothing about her personal world. She didn't attend the crew parties. She didn't date. She had acquaintances but no close friends. When people asked about her family, she'd smile politely and change the subject. Her apartment building had a gym on the 2nd floor, but Sarah had a membership to a private facility 20 minutes away because she preferred the controlled environment and the predictable crowd. Even her morning jogs followed the exact same route, down the same streets, past the same coffee shops that were just opening their shutters to the dawn. People who knew her well, and there weren't many, might have called her lonely. But Sarah would have said she was focused. On October 15, 2015, Sarah Chen woke at exactly 5:00 a.m., as she did every morning. She'd been scheduled for Flight 237, a regional route from Portland to Seattle departing at noon. It was a flight she'd flown dozens of times. The weather forecast called for clear skies and light winds. Everything pointed to a routine day. She spent the next 37 minutes going through her morning ritual with the same care she applied to everything else. She pulled on her running clothes, gray athletic tights, a black long-sleeved technical shirt, her current pair of black Nike running shoes. She drank a glass of water and stepped out of her apartment at 5:47 a.m., exactly as she had on 1,095 previous mornings. The building's lobby was empty except for Marcus, the night security guard, who was reading a thriller on the desk. He looked up as Sarah passed. "Morning, Miss Chen. Beautiful day for a run," Marcus said. He always said something like this. She always nodded politely in return. This morning was no exception. "Good morning, Marcus," she replied, pushing through the glass doors into the cool October air. The city was waking up. A few more people were out now. Sarah stretched her calves against a nearby wall, moving through a routine she'd developed years ago. She ran through the checklist in her mind. Shoes properly tied, hair secured, phone left at home on the charger where it always was during her run. She didn't like being interrupted. She didn't like people knowing where to find her during this sacred hour. The run was the one part of her day where she existed entirely for herself. Not as a pilot, not as a professional, not as anything other than a body moving through space. She set off down Pearl Street, heading toward the river. The morning was so beautiful it almost hurt to look at it. The kind of morning that made you feel alive, made you grateful for the simple fact of existence. Other runners passed her, a couple in matching Nike gear, an older man with a dog, a young woman with purple earbuds. Nobody paid her attention. Why would they? She was just another jogger in a city full of joggers, one anonymous figure among millions. By 6:32 a.m., Sarah had completed her usual route and was heading back toward the Sterling. Her pulse was elevated but controlled. Her breathing was steady. Everything was exactly as it should be. She passed the same coffee shops she always passed, now busier as morning shift workers arrived. She heard a street musician tuning a guitar. She smelled fresh bread from a bakery that had just unlocked its doors. Everything was normal. Everything was routine. Everything was exactly the same as it had been the morning before, and would be the morning after. At 6:47 a.m., Sarah Chen walked back into her apartment building. Marcus waved from behind his desk as she passed through the lobby. She waved back without slowing down. She took the elevator to the 23rd floor. She entered her apartment, locked the door behind her, and initiated her post-run routine. Shower, towel, fresh clothes. She laid out her flight uniform, sharp navy blue with her pilot's insignia, on her bed. She made coffee. She reviewed her flight plan one more time, even though she'd already reviewed it twice the night before. At 8:15 a.m., Sarah sat at her kitchen table with her coffee, looking out at Portland spread below her like a kingdom. She had 3 hours and 45 minutes before she needed to be at the airport. Everything was perfect. Everything was in order. She had no way of knowing that she was living the last normal moments of her life. She had no way of knowing that the routine she'd built with such care, the precision she'd cultivated like a garden, would soon dissolve into mystery. In a few hours, she would disappear. And no one would ever fully understand why. The coffee had gone cold 3 hours ago. Michael Chen stared at it anyway, watching the surface tension create a thin film of oils across the top. He was in his home office, a converted spare bedroom in the Beaverton, Oregon home he shared with his wife Rebecca and their 4-year-old daughter, also named Sarah. The office was less a place of work and more a shrine to obsession. Every wall held photographs. Every surface held case files. His desk was cluttered with printouts from missing persons websites, notes scribbled in his own handwriting, and copies of police reports he'd requested so many times that the officers at the Portland Police Bureau knew him by name. The calendar on the wall showed October 2015 circled in red. That was the month Sarah disappeared. Beneath it, Michael had written in thick black marker, 2,556 days. That was how many days it had been since his sister had vanished. He updated the number obsessively, sometimes twice a day, as if keeping count gave the disappearance meaning, as if the tally somehow brought him closer to understanding. Michael had always been the overlooked sibling. Sarah was the bright star, decorated Air Force pilot, professional achiever, the kind of person who walked into a room and commanded attention simply by existing. Michael was the quiet one. He'd become an engineer, a good one, but his accomplishments never seemed as shiny, as impressive. When Sarah disappeared, the entire family had suddenly revolved around her absence. In death or disappearance, she'd finally consumed everything. And Michael had decided that if he couldn't be impressive like his sister, he would at least be tireless in finding her. In the beginning, the first few weeks, Michael had barely slept. He'd worked with the police, provided them with Sarah's background, her schedule, her routines. He'd walked the streets of Portland at night, showing her photograph to strangers, hoping that anyone had seen something. He'd checked every hospital, every shelter, every clinic in a 100-mile radius. Rebecca had supported him then, bringing him coffee, reminding him to eat. But weeks turned to months, and months turned to years, and the searching never stopped. By year 2, Michael had spent nearly $40,000 on private investigators. He'd mortgaged his 401k. Rebecca had asked him gently to stop, and when he hadn't, she'd asked him firmly. He'd promised to slow down. He hadn't. Instead, he'd become more creative in his obsession. He'd learned to use dark web forums where missing persons cases were discussed by amateur detectives and professionals alike. He'd connected with other families who'd lost people, forming an informal network of obsessives just like himself. He'd learned more about investigative techniques than some working detectives knew. Rebecca loved her husband, but she watched him disappear in his own way slowly over years. She watched him come home from his engineering job and immediately go to his office to search forums, send emails to private investigators, update his missing sister website. She watched him miss dinner with his parents because he was following up on a lead that would inevitably go nowhere. She watched him take the money they'd saved for a house and pour it into searches that turned up nothing. The birth of their daughter changed something, though not in the way Rebecca hoped. When little Sarah was born in 2017, Michael wept, but his tears were complicated. He held his infant daughter and saw both the miracle of new life and the absence of his sister. He named the girl Sarah without asking Rebecca, just announcing it as if it were already decided. Rebecca had cried that night silently, understanding what it meant. Their daughter would live in the shadow of Sarah's disappearance. She would be named after a ghost. By year 4, Michael had developed a routine within his routine. Every morning before work, he spent an hour online. He checked message boards. He reviewed his missing persons website, which got maybe 50 hits a week, mostly from people looking for their own lost loved ones, hoping Michael's strategy might work for them. He reached out to Sarah's old colleagues, her friends, the few people who knew her, sending them follow-up emails asking if they'd remembered anything new. Most had long ago stopped responding. A few replied out of pity or obligation, repeating information they'd already given to police years before. At work, Michael excelled. This was his secret weapon against complete dissolution. He threw himself into his engineering projects with the same intensity he applied to finding Sarah. His boss noticed he was especially brilliant when working on complex problems. He didn't know that Michael had learned to compartmentalize, work mind and obsessed mind. The two existed side by side, never quite fully integrated. Michael earned a promotion in year 5, though he almost turned it down because it would require more hours, fewer hours for searching. Rebecca suggested therapy. Michael agreed to it. The therapist was competent and kind, and for 6 months, Michael went to her office and discussed his obsession, but nothing changed. The therapist helped him understand why he was searching, not helped him stop searching. Understanding the psychology behind the obsession didn't make the obsession any less real or demanding. The hardest part, he would later tell people, wasn't the not knowing. It was the false hope. Every few months there would be a sighting. A woman matching Sarah's description had been spotted at a rest stop in Idaho. A pilot named Sarah Chen had been seen getting off a bus in Sacramento. Each lead would spiral through his mind, through the police database, through private investigators. Each would eventually dead end. Each would cost him money he didn't have and hope he couldn't afford to lose. But he couldn't help himself. What if the next lead was real? By year 6, Michael had become a different person. Rebecca didn't recognize him anymore. Their marriage, once warm and full of laughter, had become a careful dance around his obsession. They still loved each other, but the ease had vanished. They made love less frequently. They talked about anything except Sarah. Rebecca joined a support group for families of missing persons, not because she needed support for Sarah, but because she needed support for living with Michael. Little Sarah, now 7 years old, knew her aunt only through photographs and stories. She didn't understand why her father cried sometimes for no reason. She didn't understand why her mother looked so tired. She sensed somehow that she carried a ghost's name, that she was a replacement for something lost, a pale echo of someone important. Michael kept searching anyway. By the 7th year, the burns had turned to scar tissue. The obsession had become background noise, a constant hum that he barely noticed anymore. He'd made peace of a sort with the possibility that he might never know what happened. This peace was its own kind of torture. On a gray November evening in 2022, Michael was in his office, updating his database when his phone rang. The voice on the other end was calm and professional. A park ranger in Montana. A woman found in the forest. DNA confirmation pending, but it looked promising. Michael's hands shook as he held the phone. 7 years of silence was about to end. And he had no idea if he was ready for what came next. The drive from Portland to Missoula, Montana took 12 hours. Michael drove it in 11, stopping only for gas and terrible coffee at a truck stop in eastern Oregon. Rebecca had begged to come with him, but he'd told her to stay with their daughter. He needed to do this alone. He needed to see his sister before anyone else did. He needed to be the first person to tell her that she was loved, that she was found, that she was home. The highway stretched endlessly before him, and Michael's mind spiraled through possibilities. What condition would she be in? How had she survived 7 years? Where had she been? The detective had been vague, saying only that a park ranger had found her wandering near a national forest road in rural Montana, appearing disoriented and malnourished. She'd been brought to Missoula Medical Center, where she was being held pending identification. When they ran her fingerprints through the FBI database, they got a match immediately. Sarah Chen, missing since October 2015, reported by her brother Michael Chen, was alive. Michael had pulled over twice to cry. The hospital parking lot seemed too bright. The Montana sun was harsh and unforgiving, turning everything into sharp contrasts of light and shadow. Michael sat in his car for 10 minutes before he could make himself get out. His hands were shaking. 7 years. 7 years of searching, of hopping, of desperate prayers to a God he wasn't sure he believed in. And now, suddenly, it was over. But as he walked toward the hospital entrance, Michael felt something unexpected. Terror. Detective Sarah Winters met him in the lobby. She was a woman in her 50s, with kind eyes that had seen too much suffering. She'd been assigned to verify the identification, to document the case reopening, to begin the investigation into where Sarah Chen had been and what had happened to her. She shook Michael's hand firmly. "Your sister is on the 3rd floor," Detective Winters said. "I need to warn you, Mr. Chen, her condition is complex. She's physically malnourished but stable. The doctors have cleared her for visitors, but mentally, emotionally, she's in a precarious state." "What do you mean?" Michael asked, though part of him already knew. "She has no memory of the past 7 years. The preliminary evaluation suggests extensive retrograde amnesia. She doesn't remember who she is. She doesn't remember her life before the disappearance. You need to be prepared for that." The elevator ride to the 3rd floor felt both infinitely long and too short. Michael's stomach churned. He stepped out into a hallway that smelled like bleach and institutional food. A nurse pointed him toward a room on the left. His feet carried him forward even as his mind screamed to run away. Part of him wanted to turn around, drive back to Portland, and preserve the fantasy he'd held for 7 years, the fantasy of his sister, unchanged, finally coming home. The woman in the hospital bed barely resembled the Sarah he remembered. She was gaunt. Her cheekbones were so prominent they looked like they might cut through her skin. Her hair, which had always been thick and black, was thin and streaked with gray. Her eyes, once sharp and intelligent, were hollow and confused. She was staring out the window at the Montana landscape beyond, and she didn't even turn when Michael entered the room. "Sarah," he whispered. The woman turned toward the sound. her eyes focused on him without recognition. There was a moment, just a fraction of a second, where Michael could see her searching her mind for context, trying to place him. But there was nothing. Her expression remained blank. "I'm Michael," he said, moving closer to the bed. "Your brother." She continued to stare at him. There was no spark of recognition, no emotional response. It was like looking at a stranger wearing his sister's face. A nurse standing quietly in the corner had warned him about this, but warnings couldn't prepare him for the actual experience of being looked at by his sister with absolutely no acknowledgement of kinship. "I don't," Sarah started, then stopped. Her voice was hoarse as if she hadn't spoken in years. "I don't know you." Those words, simple and factual as they were, broke something inside Michael. He pulled a chair close to her bed and sat down heavily. He wanted to reach for her hand, but something in her body language suggested she wouldn't welcome the touch. "It's okay," he said, though it wasn't okay. "Nothing about this was okay. You've been missing for a long time, but we found you. You're safe now." Sarah turned her head away, back toward the window. When she spoke again, her voice was distant. "I don't remember anything. The doctors keep asking me questions and I can't answer them. I don't know my name. I don't know how I got to that forest. I don't know anything." The next several hours were a master class in heartbreak. Michael sat with his sister, a stranger wearing his sister's face, and tried to piece together what had happened. The doctors entered periodically with tests and questions. Dr. Patricia Morrison, a neurologist specializing in amnesia cases, explained that Sarah had suffered significant trauma at some point in the past 7 years. The exact nature of the trauma was unclear, but whatever it was had triggered a defensive response in her brain. Her mind, literally, had shut down her memories to protect itself. Retrograde amnesia of this severity is unusual, Dr. Morrison explained to Michael in the hallway, away from Sarah's hearing. Typically, we see it in cases of severe head trauma or profound psychological shock. Your sister's scans show no evidence of significant head injury, though we can't rule out past trauma that healed. What we do know is that her mind has essentially created a wall. She remembers facts, she knows language, she understands the world, but personal memories, identity, autobiographical details, they're simply gone. "Can they come back?" Michael asked. "Possibly. Some cases of retrograde amnesia spontaneously resolve. Others respond to therapy. But in severe cases like this, we may be looking at permanent or near-permanent memory loss. I don't want to give you false hope." Michael stood in that hospital hallway and felt his hope, the thing that had sustained him through 7 years of searching, begin to crack into pieces. He'd found his sister, but his sister was lost in a way that finding couldn't fix. When he returned to her room, Sarah was asleep, her thin chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. She looked fragile, as if she might blow away if someone opened a window. Michael sat beside her bed and cried silently, mourning a sister he'd searched 7 years to find, only to discover that even though she was alive, she was irretrievably lost to him. The woman who'd vanished in 2015 hadn't come back. Instead, a ghost had returned, someone wearing Sarah's face and body but inhabited by a stranger. Michael pulled his chair close to the hospital bed and spent the night watching his sister sleep, wondering if the person he'd loved had died in that forest 7 years ago, and if what had come back was merely the shell that remained. By dawn, he still hadn't found an answer. The physical therapy room at Missoula Medical Center smelled like rubber mats and antiseptic. Sarah sat on a low bench, a resistance band wrapped around her legs, moving through repetitive motions that were supposed to strengthen muscles that had atrophied during 7 years of what? She still didn't know. The physical therapist, a patient man named David, counted out loud as she worked. 23, 24, 25. His voice was gentle, never demanding, never frustrated. Sarah appreciated that. Most people seemed frustrated with her, though they tried to hide it. They wanted her to remember. She wanted her to remember, but wanting didn't make it happen. By the second week in the hospital, Sarah had accepted a strange new reality. She was a stranger to everyone, including herself. They told her she was 28 years old, though she felt ageless, untethered to any particular point in time. They told her she was a pilot, and something in that word resonated, a deep, cellular recognition that made her hands want to move in certain ways, that made her understand technical diagrams without anyone explaining them. But she couldn't remember flying. She couldn't remember any single flight, any takeoff, any landing. The knowledge existed in her body like a phantom limb sensation, present but impossible to grasp. Dr. Patricia Morrison ran her through a series of cognitive tests twice a week. Patricia was a neurologist in her early 60s with silver hair pulled back in a practical bun, and an intensity in her eyes that suggested she took her patients' minds as seriously as neurosurgeons took their brains. She was kind, but she was also clinical. She measured Sarah's progress in percentages and neural response patterns, not in emotional milestones. "Your semantic memory appears intact," Patricia explained during one session, showing Sarah images and asking her to name them. Sarah could identify objects, understand language, grasp abstract concepts, but her episodic memory, the memory of her own life, her own experiences, was devastated. It's as if your brain made a choice to protect itself by erasing the personal narrative. We see this sometimes in severe trauma cases. The mind essentially says, "I cannot process what happened, so I will erase it." "Will I remember?" Sarah asked. She'd asked this question 100 times. Patricia always gave her the same answer, maybe. They didn't know, they couldn't promise. Some patients recovered their memories entirely. Others recovered fragments. Some never remembered anything at all. Michael visited every day. He would sit in a chair beside her bed and tell her stories about a life she couldn't remember. He talked about their childhood in California, about their mother's love of gardening, about Sarah's first plane ride at age 10. He talked about her Air Force career, her determination, her courage. Sarah listened politely, but it all felt like a story being told about someone else. The emotions didn't connect. She felt sympathy for the girl in Michael's stories, but not personal recognition. "I'm sorry," she told him one afternoon, a week into her hospitalization. "I'm sorry I can't remember you. I can see that you love me, and I'm sorry that I can't feel that love back the way I should." Michael's face crumpled. He reached for her hand, and this time she let him take it. "You will," he said, though his voice suggested he wasn't entirely sure. "The doctors said memories can come back. You just need time." But time moved strangely in the hospital. Days felt simultaneously endless and compressed. Sarah did her physical therapy. She attended occupational therapy where they tried to help her relearn basic life skills, though she seemed to know most of them instinctively. She sat with Dr. Morrison for cognitive therapy. She walked the hospital hallways with Michael, who pointed out things he thought might trigger memories. Nothing did. The past remained sealed off, a vault she couldn't access no matter how hard she tried. 2 weeks into her recovery, something shifted. Sarah was in physical therapy, working with resistance bands, when she felt a sudden, overwhelming need to move her hands in a specific way. David, her physical therapist, noticed her struggling against the resistance. "What's wrong?" he asked. "I don't know," Sarah said. "I feel like my hands want to do something else, something specific." They stopped the therapy. David brought her to a table with various objects, blocks, balls, a computer keyboard. Sarah's hands moved across the keyboard with surprising precision, typing sequences of numbers and commands that made no conscious sense to her, but that her fingers knew perfectly. "You're typing code," David said, surprised. "Do you know what you're doing?" Sarah stared at her own hands as if they belonged to someone else. "No, but I think I do. It feels like remembering, but not remembering. It's like watching someone else do something and knowing you've done it before." Word spread through the hospital. Dr. Morrison came to observe. She watched as Sarah's hands moved through complex technical sequences without her conscious understanding. "This is actually a positive sign," Patricia said. "Your procedural memory, the memory of how to do things, appears to be intact. It suggests that while your personal memories are suppressed, your skill memories are preserved. Your brain kept the knowledge and erased the identity." This discovery opened new possibilities. Over the following weeks, they tested Sarah systematically. She could fly a flight simulator with surprising competence, though she had no memory of being trained to fly. She could read aviation charts and understand complex mechanical systems. She could do mathematics at a high level. She knew languages, English, Mandarin, French, though she couldn't remember learning them. She was a woman of extraordinary competence with no memory of acquiring her competencies. But there were also strange gaps. She couldn't hold conversations about popular culture past 2015. She had no memory of current events. She was trapped in a psychological time freeze, her knowledge locked in the moment of her disappearance. She understood nothing about the 7 years that had passed. When Michael tried to explain smartphones and social media and the ways technology had changed, she listened with detached interest, as if he were describing an alien world. One afternoon, nearly 3 weeks into her hospitalization, Sarah sat in her hospital room watching a documentary about aircraft that was playing on the television. A fighter jet appeared on the screen, executing a complex aerial maneuver. She gasped. Her heart rate elevated. Something visceral had been triggered. "What is it?" Michael asked, startled by her reaction. "I know how to do that," Sarah said quietly, her eyes fixed on the screen. "I know exactly how to fly that plane. The G-forces, the instrument readings, the emergency procedures. I know all of it, but I can't remember when I learned it. I can't remember the planes I've flown. I can't remember any of it." She began to cry then, great heaving sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her, from the place where her identity should have been. Michael held her, and for the first time since her discovery, Sarah didn't pull away. She let herself be held by this stranger who loved her, this man who was apparently her brother, this person who was trying to help her reassemble a self that felt like it had been scattered into 1,000 pieces. That night, as she lay in her hospital bed unable to sleep, Sarah made a decision. She would rebuild herself, not as the woman she had been. That Sarah seemed like a stranger with extraordinary accomplishments and inexplicable choices. Instead, she would become someone new. She would take the skills she possessed and the brother who loved her and the slowly returning fragments of memory, and she would construct a life that made sense. It wouldn't be the same life. But it would be a life. Portland International Airport hadn't changed. That was Sarah's first thought as Michael pulled into the employee parking lot on a gray March afternoon. The terminal building still stood with its characteristic geometric architecture. The runways still stretched into the distance like gray ribbons. The control tower still rose above everything else with its solitary dominance. But everything had changed. 7 years had passed. She had disappeared and been found. The woman who'd last walked through this airport no longer existed. And yet the buildings remained exactly the same, as if time had frozen here while her life had shattered and reformed into something unrecognizable. "You don't have to do this," Michael said, though he'd said this 3 times already, once at the hospital, once in the car, once at the parking lot entrance. "We can turn around right now. There's no pressure." Sarah shook her head. She'd been discharged from the hospital 2 weeks earlier, her physical recovery deemed adequate. Mentally and psychologically, she remained a work in progress. Dr. Morrison had cautioned that returning to the site of her former identity might be triggering, but Sarah had decided that avoidance was a luxury she couldn't afford. Her brain had locked away her memories. The only way forward was to confront the spaces and places that had once defined her, hoping that something, anything, would crack open the vault. The employee entrance was the same route she'd walked 1,000 times, though she didn't remember walking it even once. Security recognized Michael, which surprised her until he explained that he'd come here repeatedly during her missing years, showing her photograph to anyone who might remember her, asking if they'd seen anything unusual that October morning. The man at security, a broad-shouldered veteran named Thomas, stared at Sarah with an expression caught between wonder and disbelief. "Ms. Chen," he said slowly, we heard you'd been found. My God, it's good to see you." Sarah offered a polite smile, though she felt nothing. He was a stranger using her name like he knew her. The kindness in his eyes was directed at someone she'd never met. The Pacific Airways administrative office was on the second floor. Jennifer Walsh, the hearing manager who'd overseen Sarah's employment, had called Michael a week ago with an unexpected proposal. Jennifer had been the one to hire Sarah 7 years ago, the one who'd watched her excel, the one who'd mourned her disappearance. Now she wanted to see if Sarah might consider coming back. Not full-time flying, not yet, but perhaps observation, perhaps volunteer work in some capacity. The airline wanted to help. They believed in second chances. Jennifer's office was warm and professional. She was a woman in her mid-50s with kind eyes and genuine emotion that made Sarah uncomfortable. Jennifer hugged her, something Sarah tolerated rather than welcomed, her body remaining stiff in the embrace. "Sarah, I can't tell you how much this means," Jennifer said, settling into her chair. "I never stopped thinking about you. The whole airline mourned you, and now to have you back." Her voice trailed off, emotion catching in her throat. Sarah understood intellectually that she should feel gratitude. Jennifer had been important to her, though Sarah couldn't access that history. She existed in a strange position, beloved by people she didn't know, appreciated for accomplishments she couldn't remember, welcomed back into a life she'd never left voluntarily. "Michael mentioned you might have an opportunity," Sarah said carefully. She'd learned to speak in measured tones, always slightly formal, never quite natural. It was safer that way. Jennifer nodded eagerly. "We have a cross-country flight tomorrow, Portland to Denver. One of our senior captains, James Riley, you might remember him, is flying. We thought it might help if you could observe from the jump seat. No pressure to do anything, just observe. See if it triggers anything, see if it feels right." Sarah felt something shift in her chest, a sensation that might have been fear or anticipation or both simultaneously. Flying. The one thing her body remembered even when her mind couldn't. The one skill that remained unambiguous and intact despite the catastrophic loss of everything else. "I want to do it," she said. Michael and Jennifer exchanged glances. They'd expected her to need time to consider. Instead, she'd answered immediately as if some part of her, some buried, instinctive part, had been waiting for exactly this opportunity. The rest of the afternoon passed in preparation. Jennifer arranged for her to receive a temporary employee badge. A flight attendant took her on a tour of the airport, showing her the crew lounge, the flight planning area, the dispatch office. Nothing felt familiar, and yet everything felt somehow right. Her feet moved with purpose through corridors she didn't remember but navigated intuitively. Her hands reached for information she didn't consciously access. Her body knew this place. That evening back at Michael's house, Sarah couldn't sleep. She lay in the guest room. Michael had insisted she stay with them rather than rush into living independently, and stared at the ceiling. Tomorrow she would return to the cockpit, not as a captain, not as a pilot. As an observer, a passenger, a ghost haunting her own life. But her hands knew what to do. Her instincts remained intact. She was afraid and exhilarated in equal measure. She thought about the woman who'd walked into this airport 7 years ago, the woman named Sarah Chen who disappeared without explanation. That woman had been competent and isolated, and somehow desperate enough to vanish completely. Sarah didn't understand that desperation. She didn't understand what could drive someone to choose disappearance over confrontation. But she wondered if maybe, in the months to come, some fragment of memory might illuminate that choice. At 4:00 a.m., she gave up on sleep entirely. She dressed carefully in the clothes Jennifer had provided, a new uniform, darker than she remembered, though she couldn't actually remember what uniform looked like. She looked in the mirror and saw a stranger in a pilot's uniform, a woman playing a role she was supposed to have lived. Michael drove her to the airport in darkness. The pre-dawn hours at Portland International Airport were quiet, peaceful. A few employees moved through the terminal preparing for the coming day. The planes sat silent on the tarmac, waiting. Captain James Riley was waiting in the crew lounge when Sarah arrived. He was a man in his 50s, broad-shouldered and weathered, with the bearing of someone who'd spent decades at the controls of aircraft. When he saw Sarah, his face softened with genuine emotion. "Sarah Chen," he said, approaching with his hand extended. "God, it's good to see you. We all wondered what happened, the rumors, the speculation, but you're here now. That's what matters." She shook his hand. His grip was firm and reassuring. He was a man who inspired confidence, who'd spent decades keeping people safe. Today, she would sit behind him and watch him do what she'd apparently done 1,000 times before her disappearance. The pre-flight briefing included the co-pilot, Brandon Harris, a younger man in his late 20s who was new to the airline and who looked at Sarah with awe. As far as he knew, she was a legendary figure, the missing pilot who'd somehow returned. She was mythologized in his mind, transformed by absence into something greater than she'd probably ever been in life. 2 hours later, Sarah stood in the jetway, looking at the aircraft that would take her back to the sky. Her hands trembled slightly, though she couldn't say whether it was from fear or anticipation. Michael was not allowed beyond this point. She was on her own now, about to step back into a world she'd left 7 years ago without understanding why. She climbed the stairs into the cockpit, took her seat in the jump seat directly behind and between the two pilot seats, and looked out at the runway stretching before her. Everything was about to change. She just didn't know it yet. The takeoff was perfect. That was Sarah's first clear thought as Flight 447 lifted off from Portland International Airport and climbed toward the clear blue sky. The acceleration pressed her gently back into the jump seat. The nose pitched up at exactly the right angle. Captain Riley's hands moved across the controls with practiced precision, coordinating with air traffic control in that distinctive aviation cadence, clipped, professional, efficient. Brandon Harris, the co-pilot, monitored the instruments with appropriate attentiveness. Everything was textbook. Everything was exactly as it should be. For the first time since her discovery in Montana, Sarah felt something close to peace. Her body was home. Even without her memory, even without understanding her past, her nervous system recognized this place. The vibration of the engines, the particular quality of light through the cockpit windows, the smell of recycled air mixed with coffee and cleaning supplies, these sensations resonated at a cellular level. Her hands, resting in her lap, felt the slight movements of the aircraft and responded with micro-adjustments of muscle tension. Her brain might have abandoned her history, but her body remembered everything. Captain Riley turned to her with a smile. "Pretty smooth out here today, Ms. Chen. Good conditions all the way to Denver. We should have a very uneventful flight." "That's good," Sarah replied, and she meant it. She didn't need drama. She needed normalcy. She needed to prove to herself that she could exist in this space without fracturing apart. The first hour of flight passed without incident. They climbed to their cruise altitude of 35,000 feet. The autopilot engaged. The aircraft settled into its steady trajectory across Oregon and Idaho toward Colorado. Sarah watched the landscape unfold below them. Mountains, forests, rivers, the vast emptiness of the American West. She found herself relaxing incrementally, letting the familiar environment soothe something deep in her psyche. Then at exactly 10:47 a.m., everything changed. Captain Riley was in the middle of a routine check when it happened. He was reviewing a navigation update from air traffic control, his hand reaching for the radio button on the control yoke. But mid-motion, his entire body seized. His hands jerked violently, pulling back on the yoke. His head dropped forward, then snapped back against the headrest. A sound escaped him, not quite a word, not quite a scream, a guttural, involuntary noise that had no human meaning. "Captain," Brandon's voice cracked with immediate concern. "Captain Riley, are you okay?" Riley didn't respond. His body convulsed again, his left arm spasming across the instrument panel. The radio came on accidentally, broadcasting incomprehensible sounds into the ether. The aircraft began to deviate from its flight path. Alarms screamed to life in the cockpit. The automated systems detected the deviation and began their warnings. The angle of attack indicator flashed red. The autopilot disengaged automatically because the human inputs were conflicting with the programmed flight path. Brandon reached for the controls instinctively, but he was too slow, too unprepared for a medical emergency and his captain at cruise altitude. "We need to declare an emergency," Brandon shouted, his voice pitched higher than necessary. He was panicking. Sarah could hear it in the tremor of his words, could see it in the rigidity of his shoulders. Sarah's body moved before her mind could process what was happening. The jump seat was in the center, positioned directly between and behind the two pilot seats. She'd studied the cockpit layout during the pre-flight briefing, memorizing exits and positions despite not knowing why it felt important. Now her training she didn't remember receiving, took over. She unbuckled from the jump seat. The aircraft was no longer flying level. It was climbing, the nose pitched up too steeply, causing the aircraft to begin slowing dangerously. The airspeed indicator showed they were approaching a stall. "Mayday, mayday, mayday," Brandon was transmitting, his words running together. "Flight 447 declaring emergency. The captain is incapacitated. Medical emergency." Denver Center responded immediately. "Flight 447, roger your mayday. Say your position and current heading." We're. Brandon fumbled with the navigation. He was frozen by the magnitude of the moment, by the weight of 200 passengers and crew depending on his ability to function under pressure he wasn't trained for. "We're approximately 120 miles northwest of your airspace descending." "No, we're climbing. We're in a climb." Sarah was moving now, her hands reaching out to steady herself as the aircraft pitched higher. Captain Riley had gone slack in his seat, his body convulsing slightly, his eyes rolling back. She could see the telltale signs of cardiac distress, the pallor, the involuntary movements, the absolute unresponsiveness. He wasn't coming back. Not in the next few critical seconds, possibly not at all. The aircraft was climbing too steeply. The airspeed continued to decrease. They were approaching a stall, a condition where the wings lose their lift because the aircraft is flying too slowly. At 35,000 feet, a stall was potentially catastrophic. "I've got it," Sarah heard herself say. Her voice was calm, steady, authoritative. It was the voice of someone who'd given commands in cockpits before, someone who understood the weight of responsibility. "Brandon, I've got the aircraft." "What? No, Sarah didn't wait for permission. She took the controls. Her hands moved from emergency awareness to active control, pushing forward on the yoke to reduce the pitch angle, banking the aircraft to level the wings. Brandon was staring at her in shock. "Help me get the captain out of the seat," Sarah commanded. "And call it out. Tell them we have a pilot observer taking the controls." Brandon acted on instinct, unbuckling Captain Riley and attempting to move his convulsing body out of the way. Riley was deadweight, heavy and uncoordinated, his body still in the grip of whatever medical event had struck him. But together, Sarah and Brandon managed to pull him partially out of the seat, enough to clear the controls. Sarah's hands flew across the cockpit with muscle memory that transcended her amnesia. She initiated descent procedures. She corrected the flight path that Brandon's panicked inputs had distorted. She communicated clearly with Denver Center, her radio calls precise and professional. "Denver Center, Flight 447. Captain has suffered a medical emergency, presumed cardiac event. I'm taking the aircraft. Current position, 120 miles northwest of your airspace, descending to 25,000 feet. Requesting immediate divert to nearest suitable airport." There was a moment of silence on the radio. Then, Flight 447, Roger. Stand by for vectors to Grand Junction Regional. Say your position as pilot in command. Sarah's hands were steady on the controls. The aircraft was responding to her inputs exactly as it should. The airspeed stabilized. The descent became controlled. Behind her, Brandon was attempting to provide basic first aid to Captain Riley, loosening his collar, placing him in the recovery position, requesting the flight attendant bring oxygen. Grand Junction is 11 miles ahead, Flight 447, Denver Center came back. You're cleared for immediate landing. Emergency vehicles standing by. Roger that, Grand Junction. Flight 447 is proceeding for emergency landing, Sarah confirmed. She could feel 178 pairs of eyes on her from behind the cockpit door. She could feel the weight of expectation and fear and desperate hope, but her focus remained absolute. She'd trained for this, though she couldn't remember the training. Her body knew what to do. Her mind had been locked away, but her instincts remained free. The runway appeared before her, a beautiful stretch of asphalt that suddenly represented safety, sanctuary, redemption. Sarah aligned the aircraft perfectly, maintaining the correct descent rate, managing the speed, positioning everything for the smooth landing that would save everyone aboard. The wheels touched the runway at 10:51 a.m. For a moment, there was absolute silence in the cockpit. Then, from the main cabin, it began. Applause, cheering, people crying with relief. Sarah remained focused, taxiing the aircraft to a safe position and bringing the engines to idle. Only when the parking brake was set and the engines were shut down did Sarah allow her hands to stop shaking. She just saved 200 lives. She had no memory of being trained to do it, but her body had known exactly what to do. And somehow, that would change everything. The emergency vehicles were waiting when Flight 447 came to a complete stop. Ambulances with sirens, fire trucks with lights flashing, police cars positioned at tactical distances. The aircraft was surrounded by controlled chaos, everyone moving with purpose, everyone focused on one objective: get Captain Riley medical attention. The paramedics rushed into the cockpit with their equipment, their professionalism a stark contrast to the ordinariness of the moment before. Captain Riley was alive but unresponsive, his cardiac event having left him in a critical state. Sarah sat in the jump seat, her hands still gripping the armrests, unable to release them. Her body was shaking with the adrenaline crash of survival, of crisis averted, of 178 lives saved. The paramedics pushed past her, moving with practiced efficiency. One of them, a woman with kind eyes and a gentle touch, placed a hand on Sarah's shoulder. "Are you hurt?" the paramedic asked. Sarah couldn't answer. She wasn't hurt physically, but something inside her had cracked open. The vault that her mind had constructed so carefully was fracturing. Memories were beginning to bleed through the cracks like water through a broken dam. Brandon Harris was being interviewed by the National Transportation Safety Board investigator within minutes of the aircraft coming to a stop. He kept repeating the same phrase. She knew what to do. I've never seen anything like it. She was so calm. She saved all of us. Michael had been waiting in the Portland terminal when the news came through. His phone had exploded with notifications, news alerts, calls from colleagues, messages from people he hadn't heard from in years. His sister, the missing pilot, had just saved a plane full of people. The irony was almost too much to bear. She'd been lost for 7 years, found only to prove that in some fundamental way she'd never been lost at all. He drove to Grand Junction, racing across the high desert of Oregon and Idaho, covering in 8 hours what would normally take 10. He needed to see her. He needed to understand what had happened. He needed to know if this moment meant what he thought it meant. Sarah was in a private room at Grand Junction Medical Center, having been cleared by emergency physicians. Medically, she was unharmed. Psychologically, she was in the process of a transformation that no one had anticipated. The stress, the adrenaline, The absolute demand placed on her nervous system had done something that 7 weeks of therapy couldn't accomplish. She was remembering. The memories came in fragments at first, disconnected and strange. She was sitting on a hospital bed, still wearing her uniform when the first clear memory surfaced. She was in a car. Night, mountains, rain on the windshield. The car was spinning, metal screaming. Pain. She gasped, her hand flying to her head as if she could physically contain the memory. A nurse rushed in, thinking she was having an adverse reaction. "It's okay," Sarah whispered. "I'm okay, I remembered something." The nurse called Dr. Morrison immediately. Patricia was in Denver, presenting at a neurology conference, but she caught the first flight back to Grand Junction. She arrived at the hospital 4 hours later, moving with purpose into Sarah's room. "Tell me everything," Patricia said, pulling up a chair. "Every fragment, no matter how small or disconnected it seems." The memories were coming faster now, triggered by her consciousness trying to process what had happened in the cockpit. Sarah's hands had known how to fly because they'd flown before. Her voice had known how to command because it had commanded before. The muscle memory had been so powerful, so ingrained, that it had overridden the amnesia. And somehow, using those instincts, something in her brain had begun to unlock. "I was driving," Sarah said slowly, her eyes closed as she tried to grasp at the images. "There was an accident, I remember. I remember being afraid, being confused. There was a person, a man. He helped me." "What was his name?" Patricia asked gently. "I don't know, I can't see his face, but I remember being lost. I remember thinking that if I went back, if I returned to my life, no one would understand. I remember deciding." She stopped. The memory was there, so close she could almost touch it, but it remained obscured, like trying to see something underwater. "I remember deciding to disappear," she finished quietly. Patricia made notes, her clinical mind processing what Sarah was saying through the lens of neuroscience. "Dissociative fugue," she murmured. "A traumatic event, severe psychological distress, and a deliberate choice to flee and abandon identity. The amnesia wasn't purely physiological. Your mind chose to forget because remembering was too painful." Sarah opened her eyes. "But I'm remembering now." "Yes. The intense stress of the emergency landing seems to have overwhelmed the psychological defense mechanism that was maintaining the amnesia. Your brain, faced with immediate life-or-death circumstances, prioritized survival over protection. And in doing that, it began to crack open the sealed vault." Over the next 12 hours, more memories surfaced. Sarah remembered her childhood with Michael, specific moments, specific conversations. She remembered her mother's garden in California. She remembered her Air Force training, the grueling days at flight school, the triumph of her first solo flight. She remembered her determination to prove herself in a male-dominated field. She remembered the respect of her colleagues, the praise, the sense of accomplishment. And she began to remember why she'd run. There were fragments of a relationship that had ended badly. A pilot from another airline, someone she trusted, someone who'd hurt her in ways she was still struggling to articulate. There was pressure at work, expectations she couldn't meet, a sense of being trapped in a life that looked perfect from the outside but felt hollow from within. There was a night of desperation, a decision made in darkness, a car journey that had ended in accident and loss of consciousness. The memories weren't complete. There were still gaps, still blank spaces where her mind was too damaged or too protective to allow full recall. But the essential narrative was beginning to emerge. Sarah Chen had voluntarily disappeared because continuing to exist as Sarah Chen had felt impossible. The media discovered her story in the midst of her recovering memories. Within hours of the emergency landing, news outlets were running the headline: "Missing pilot returns to save 178 passengers." Her photograph appeared on every news network. Her hospital room became a fortress that had to be defended from reporters desperate for an interview. But Sarah barely noticed. She was too busy engaging with the woman she'd forgotten she was, A woman of extraordinary competence and extraordinary fragility. A woman who'd survived something that had seemed unsurvivable. On the second evening in the hospital, Michael held her hand. Sarah looked at her brother, this man who'd spent 7 years searching for her, who'd never stopped believing she was alive, who'd loved a ghost with absolute dedication, and she began to cry. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry for what I did to you, to all of you." "You don't need to apologize," Michael said, though tears were streaming down his face. "You're here, that's all that matters." "No," Sarah said. "I need to understand what happened. I need to understand who I was and why I chose to disappear. I need to remember all of it, even the parts that hurt." That night, as she lay in the hospital bed, Sarah understood something fundamental. The crash that had triggered her amnesia hadn't been an accident. On some level, she'd been running from herself with such desperation that her mind had chosen the only escape available, the erasure of identity itself. But now, pulled back from the edge by the absolute demand to save 200 lives, she was ready to reclaim herself, not the broken, desperate woman who disappeared, but the woman she could choose to become. 3 weeks after the emergency landing at Grand Junction, Sarah Chen sat in Dr. Patricia Morrison's office in Portland and attempted to construct a coherent narrative from the fragments of her recovered life. She had her memories back now, most of them anyway. Some details remained fuzzy, some psychological wounds still tender, but the essential story was whole. The missing 7 years had been found, retrieved from whatever dark corner of her consciousness had hidden them away. The story was both simpler and more complicated than she'd expected. There had been a man named David, a co-pilot from Southwest Airlines. They'd dated for 8 months. He'd been charming and brilliant and ultimately cruel, a man who needed to diminish her to feel powerful himself. When she tried to leave, he'd threatened to make her look unstable, to spread rumors in the tight-knit aviation community that would destroy her career. She'd been 27, terrified, and convinced that her life as she knew it was finished. She'd taken a solo drive to think, to plan, to figure out how to reclaim control. Somewhere on a mountain road near the Oregon-California border, driving in darkness and rain, she'd made a choice. The choice hadn't been clear-cut suicide, though it had contained elements of that impulse. Instead, it had been a choice to abandon the person named Sarah Chen, to let that identity die so completely that no one could hurt her anymore. She'd driven faster and faster, losing control on a wet curve, and her consciousness had mercifully shut down upon impact. A man named Robert Chen, no relation, had found her unconscious in the wrecked vehicle. He'd owned a remote cabin nearby and had been an ER nurse before retirement. He'd helped her, nursed her back to physical health, and never asked questions. When she'd woken confused and unable to remember her own name, he'd suggested she might need to be found by the people who loved her. But Sarah had been too broken, too desperate to disappear completely. She'd slipped away from his cabin one morning and had simply walked into the forest, letting herself become lost to the world. The 7 years were still somewhat mysterious, even to Sarah. There were stretches of time she'd spent with groups of transient people moving through the Pacific Northwest. There were months she'd worked under different names at various establishments, motels, restaurants, small towns where no one asked questions. There were shelters in winter, forests in summer, a deliberate and systematic erasure of the woman she'd been. And then a park ranger had found her, confused and disoriented, speaking only vaguely about anything, answering basic questions but unable to articulate an identity. The amnesia had been real. Her mind had locked away the traumatic memories of why she disappeared so completely that even she couldn't access them. But it had been psychological trauma, not physiological. Her brain had given her what she'd asked for, oblivion. What you experienced, Dr. Morrison explained, was a dissociative fugue state lasting 7 years, extraordinarily rare and extraordinarily severe, but not impossible. Your mind was protecting you from memories that felt unbearable. "But I'm not unbearable," Sarah said quietly. That was the lie I believed. That's what David made me believe. No, Patricia agreed. You're remarkably strong. Surviving 7 years homeless, rebuilding yourself from nothing, maintaining basic survival skills while your conscious mind was fragmented. That demonstrates extraordinary resilience. The media attention had been intense for about 2 weeks. Missing Pilot saves 178 lives, sold newspapers and generated clicks. But the narrative was incomplete and Sarah had made a decision to keep it that way. The details of her disappearance, her mental health crisis, her deliberate choice to abandon her identity, those were private. The public story was simple. She'd been missing, she'd been found, she'd answered her instincts when called upon. That was enough. More importantly, she'd had to answer harder questions for herself. She met with a trauma therapist 3 times a week, working through the complicated feelings about David, about the fear that had driven her to disappear, about the shame and the strength that had kept her alive. She worked with a neuropsychologist to understand how her brain had compartmentalized her memories, keeping her operational skills intact while erasing her personal identity. She worked with an aviation medical examiner to determine whether she could still fly commercially. The answer was yes. With proper support and ongoing therapy, she was medically and psychologically cleared to return to aviation. But that wasn't the question that mattered most. The question that mattered was whether she wanted to. 2 months after the emergency landing, Sarah stood in the same cockpit where she'd saved 200 lives. But this time, she wasn't there to observe. She was there to train. The FAA had granted her an emergency waiver allowing her to resume her captain's certification through an intensive retraining program. Pacific Airways had offered her a position, with the understanding that she'd work her way back into regular flying. The airline's faith in her was almost overwhelming. Captain James Riley had survived his cardiac event. He was recovering well and was expected to make a full return to flying within months. He'd asked to see Sarah before she began her retraining. "You saved my life," Riley had told her, his eyes wet with emotion. "You saved 200 people's lives. I'm never going to be able to thank you enough for that." Sarah had taken his hand. "You're the one who trained me. Well, some version of you, some version of my life. I didn't remember learning to fly, but when I needed to know, my body remembered for me. That's a gift you gave me." Now, sitting in the captain's seat with Riley supervising her retraining, Sarah moved through the procedures with a strange combination of familiarity and newness. Her hands remembered. Her mind understood. But something fundamental had shifted in her understanding of who she was. She wasn't the desperate woman who tried to disappear. She wasn't the amnesiac who'd been lost to herself. She was someone new, someone who'd been through fire and had chosen to walk back toward the light rather than remain in darkness. That evening, she met Michael and his family at a restaurant in Portland. Little Sarah, her namesake, was excited to finally meet her famous aunt. Michael's wife Rebecca was warm and accepting, having long ago forgiven the obsession that had defined their marriage during the missing years. Michael himself looked like a different person, lighter, as if a weight he'd carried for 7 years had finally been lifted. "I'm sorry," Sarah told him, the same apology she'd offered before, but this time it meant something different. "I'm sorry for the pain I caused you." "Stop," Michael said gently. "You didn't cause anything. You were in pain and you responded the only way you could. Now you're back and that's what matters." That night, alone in her apartment, a new apartment, unfamiliar, representing a fresh start, Sarah made a list of things she wanted to accomplish. Some were professional, regaining her full captain's certification, building back her flight hours, proving to herself that she could command an aircraft with competence and grace. Some were personal, rebuilding relationships, learning who she was as an adult, discovering what she wanted from life beyond the desperate scrambling of survival. But mostly, she wanted to understand something fundamental, that humans are not their worst moments. That trauma doesn't define capacity. That instinct and training, embedded deep in muscle and bone and mind, can transcend even the most catastrophic psychological fragmentation. She'd spent 7 years trying to die. She'd spent 7 more weeks learning to live. In the months and years to come, Sarah Chen would return to the skis. She would fly with the confidence of someone who'd learned that the worst that could happen had already happened, and she'd survived it. She would become a mentor to young pilots, especially women, teaching them not just technical skills but resilience. She would speak, carefully and thoughtfully, about mental health and the importance of asking for help before desperation drives you to disappear. But more than anything, she would live. The woman who'd vanished in October 2015 was gone forever. The woman who'd been lost in darkness for 7 years was also gone. In their place stood someone new, someone forged in trauma and refined in survival, someone who'd learned that the greatest act of courage wasn't disappearing, but choosing to stay. Choosing to face yourself, to rebuild yourself, to claim yourself as worthy of existence even when every instinct screamed otherwise. On a clear day in May, Sarah took the controls of Flight 447, the same aircraft she'd saved months earlier. As she pushed the throttles forward and felt the aircraft respond to her commands, she understood with absolute clarity that she'd finally come home. Not to the cockpit, not to Portland, but to herself.